Well, blessed Thursday to you as we come with your daily encouragement. And we are in verse 20 of 1 Peter chapter 2. So this is Peter's insight into slavery and the model for the Christian. As I said, these next topics that are brought up in 1 Peter are very controversial. And they're controversial not only in their day, but in our own day, where political circumstances has changed. Now, I always preface this. I don't think that either Paul or Peter are giving us a model of when we need to make a revolution like the Declaration of Independence or any of those other movements of their day when we are to advocate for those who are unjustly persecuted. They are dealing with the attitude and the example of the Christian. And that is modeled at Jesus, who counted equality with God something to be grasped, but instead took the form of a servant. And so, what he's telling people here is that you don't have your decision about where you should be in society. If you're born a slave, Peter is saying, and Paul said the same thing too, remain a slave. And also, be very, very submissive to your master as if it was the Lord. Paul gave very similar advice in Romans 13, and that has been, to many, account to either Paul or Peter that they were not taking on the idea and the personhood of a slave as an equal person. Those are later political questions. In fact, Paul even encourages Philemon to go back to his master, and I think that that would be by modern ear not a wise thing to do. But the reason that they kind of go down this route that we would not want to go down is that they are following the example of Jesus. And so my take on this as a modern Christian, American Christian, who believes that their freedom is the basis for all of your actions. We are called in our freedom, in our leadership to some extent, wherever we find ourselves, whether we find ourselves in the lower ranks of a job or at the head of a corporation or of a congregation or some other entity, is to use our freedom to, and this is the scary part, submit and enslave ourselves to the people around us, to God who is working around us. That's why there's a concept called servant leadership in our Western world that models these thorny issues a little bit differently than Paul and Peter are. But in verse 20 it says, if you endure when you are beaten for doing wrong, what credit is that? In other words, the beating that may happen, whether justly or unjustly, is first of all viewed and should be viewed as just. Look at it from a standpoint of if you are a Christian and you feel that a certain police officer or institution or group of institutions is picking on you, first of all, you don't have any right not to be picked on. If they're acting justly, they're just doing what they're called to do. They're reining in our freedom for the sake of maintaining order. But we don't always have to have that submission, that choice. We can choose in some cases, sometimes it's based on contract. We wait out the amount of the contract and we go with another company or another situation. If we have been justly punished for crimes that we get into society, we pay off our debt. We don't shirk our duty from that. We maybe can appeal it, but the government and the judicial system, even some contracts we enter into, are there to keep order, excuse me. And so we shouldn't be surprised if sometimes we're punished for those things because that's what they do. But if you endure when you are doing right, you feel like you've been persecuted and stuff, We might complain about it, but we are called to endure it for the sake of Christ, because if there is anybody who endured injustice, it was Jesus. And he suffered for it. And you have God's approval. In other words, sometimes God allows us to be persecuted. I'll just give you an example. When I was overseas, I like to give examples from overseas because many of them are examples of where I view my lens through the things that I'm justly called to do or think I have the right to do. And one of the things that happens when we go to another culture is those freedoms we find out are not free in other places. And sometimes we get punished or we are scolded, both embarrassed for acting in a way that was inappropriate. It's interesting, our U.S. government, while they will, if we have been unjustly imprisoned, can and does fight for us, but their first attitude is obey the laws of your land. You read that when they give advice about going to another country. They do not advise you, even with your political freedom, to cause revolution in another place. It's horrible of our government to come to that, but I see that same principle here in First Peter. We're not there to assert our rights of what we think and ought to take place. We should learn to live peaceably with all. There's a famous passage from Romans where Paul says the same thing. But, and Peter and Paul don't address this, if we get to a point where that injustice is palpable, I think the Spirit calls us to act. Just as it did in the civil rights movement, just as Christians did in making sure that slavery was not only illegal in this nation, but around the world, such as Wilberforce in England, who was one of the great Christian lights to abolish the international slave trade in Britain. Those are heroes of us. But I think they all started from the premise of Peter and Paul. Start with your position. Be submissive. Learn how to act in a just way, and sometimes you're going to be punished unjustly, but let that fuel your fire for a later move of the Spirit. I truly believe that we are in a better age politically. Some may disagree with that, but I think we're in a better age politically for advocating for people's rights and stuff. But it all starts with submitting, and then it leads to freedom. Because our example has been Jesus, who counted equality with God something to be grasped, but take the form of a servant. Also, because he took the form of a servant, we who were enslaved to sin are now free to both serve our neighbor and sometimes be enslaved to our neighbor and to unjust systems, but more importantly, to proclaim the gospel that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. So let's take up our cross, our slavery, and follow him. Take care. God bless. We'll see you next time.